Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we look at all things history, religion, culture, why they matter. These are, as we've said so often, grown-up conversations for grown-up people, where we attempt to take an Olympian judgment about everything, but it's a foggy day up here, so that's what we aspire to. My name's Mike Peter. I should probably mention that.
Today is the fourth episode in our series that we've been doing on apologetics. And we're very excited for today's episode. We have a special guest for you all, who Mike is now going to introduce for us.
Yeah, and who are you, madam?
Oh, sorry, Coel Campo.
I wanted to be reassured on the point. Right, great. Well, yeah, we're very pleased to have Justin with us today, Justin Brierley, a well-known broadcaster, podcaster, author. His book from last year, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, made quite the splash. It is a reportage on the changing intellectual landscape, but it itself certainly qualifies as a work of apologetics, as do indeed the podcasts that accompany the series, and we'll be providing links to those in the notes to this episode. From the early years of this century, the exact date escapes me, but probably Justin will give it to us in a moment. Right up until April last year, he was working at Premier Radio in London, mostly as theology and apologetics editor. And for a long time, he ran a show, Unbelievable, on that radio station. In fact, I think the time that we connected before was 2008, maybe 2007, when I was interviewed by him about my book, Gods of War, and I was supposed to debate an almost ridiculously friendly atheist whose opening pitch was, I read your book and I agree with nearly everything you said. And then we had to try and find a way to get us to fight after that. But it was a great time. And we've recently been put back in contact via my friend and former student, Tony Aris, who is a friend also of Justin's. His show Unbelievable resulted in a book in 2017. Well, I think it's probably been overshadowed by the success of his more recent volume. So, Justin, it's great to have you with us, and welcome to A Foggy Day on Olympus.
Oh, thank you very much. I'll try and make my way through the shrouded mists and see you there, Mike and Coel. But it's very nice to be up here on top of Mount Olympus with you.
Yeah, the air is very rarefied up here.
Absolutely.
So, Justin, we're really excited to have you here. Maybe you could just give us a little bit of background and tell us how you got into broadcasting and specifically debating with atheists and agnostics.
Yes, well, I left most of the debating really to my guests, like Mike when he came on all those years ago. I can't believe it's been that long, Mike. But yeah, that would have been 2007, 2008, whenever it was certainly the early days of the Unbelievable show, because it launched in, I think, 2005. And that was very much the heyday of new atheism. So books like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins were just being published around that time. You had a few years later the Atheist Bus campaign, if you remember that. There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life, on red London buses. And I started the Unbelievable show sort of in that environment to try and bring good faith conversations to the Christian audience, first of all, on Premier Christian Radio. But as we started podcasting, we started to get a lot of non-Christians, atheists, agnostics who started to listen, who enjoyed the conversations. So it really grew into a really interesting community of people who were listening, downloading the shows. Eventually, we got a video show together as well, and the book came out and so on. But it was just a really marvelous sort of time in those early days. I was very wet behind the ears as a journalist myself, certainly in apologetics, but I learned an awful lot in the ensuing sort of 17 plus years that I hosted that show, and got to have all kinds of really interesting guests eventually coming on both sides, not just atheists and Christians, but we did a lot of inter-Christian debates on various theological issues. We had Muslims and Jews and Hindus and people of all other worldviews coming on to sort of, to talk about things. So yeah, it was a wonderful time, and I think a show that was sort of necessary at the time it came out, especially kind of hot on the heels of the new atheism gaining a head of steam in popular culture, because I think Christians at the time especially were looking for good ways to interact and engage with these objections to faith that were, quite high on the media profile and that kind of thing. So yeah, it was a wonderful time. Though, as I say in the more recent book, the conversations did change actually towards the end of my time, as the new atheist thing started to wane eventually.
Well, of the various atheists and agnostics you debated, whose arguments gave you the most pause for thought and kind of made you sit back in your seat?
I think, I mean, there were various issues that I had to kind of come to terms with and grapple, because when I started the show, I didn't even have an opinion on many issues that then came about, and I had to kind of tangle with and work out what I believed about. I do remember in 2009 when I first had Bart Ehrman on, who's quite a well-known critic of the New Testament as a New Testament historian himself, and he'd just published a best-selling popular level book called Misquoting Jesus, which essentially cast doubt on the historical veracity of the transmission of the New Testament documents. How can we really know what the original document said, what Jesus said, and that kind of thing? And when I read that book, it did seem like quite a compelling case. It cast a lot of doubt, and so on. But really, it was you sometimes have to hear that side, and then you obviously go and read other things. And in this case, I brought on opposite Bart Peter J. Williams, who's quite a well-respected biblical scholar in Cambridge. And again, you inevitably then see the ways in which, sometimes things that are cast as in negative light can then be cast the other way by someone who's got a different perspective. And I ended up seeing that actually a lot of the criticism Bart had could equally be turned into positives for the historicity and the transmission of the documents. So there were things like that, though, which certainly sort of gave me pause for thought. And, and inevitably, some of the big classic objections to faith, the problem of suffering and evil, they come around time and again. And there's obviously answers, intellectual sort of answers that have been offered on those issues, but they always strike hard, when you're actually dealing with real issues of pain and suffering. So those were probably among the most sort of challenging kinds of conversations that I would have experienced when it came to faith.
Yeah, and to follow up with that, as you were sort of working through this kind of stuff, did you find any Christian arguments that were particularly useful in pushing back against those ideas?
Well, I'd say just as I engaged the conversations with people at various different points on the theological spectrum, I gradually started to kind of bring together kind of where I stood, what I thought made the most sense in terms of the Christian tradition and how I would respond to some of those issues. And so, yeah, as I say, with questions around the credibility of the New Testament documents, I just came to realize actually that there is a very a rich set of historical documents that we have that, compared to any other book of the ancient world, we have a wealth of documents that are as close to the time as they can be, really, and the multiplicity of which gives us a really great way of putting them all together and kind of working out what those original documents most probably said, even if we don't have the original copy. So things like that, as I looked into the issues and worked them out. The problem of suffering and evil, I'd say, I came to kind of, I found some of the theodicies, to use the technical word, quite helpful that people have developed, like Richard Swinburne and others, looking at the plausible reasons why God would allow a world that includes evil and suffering in it. As I say, the problem there is that inevitably when you're, in the weeds with someone who is going through suffering, a kind of philosophical answer isn't probably what they're looking for. And that's where I would say, at a more spiritual level, the story of Christianity is really what speaks to that. The fact that God came close and suffered himself. That's probably the one thing that someone going through suffering could probably hold on to in that sort of situation. So the conversations have been helpful at an intellectual level, but often it's those experiential, personal kind of elements that come through as well in some of the conversations that can be the most meaningful along the way. So yeah, that's some of the ways in which I've tried to put the pieces together.
Yeah, I think I understand a little bit of what you're talking about. Every time I feel like I'm out here recording with Mike, he says something to sort of challenge the way that I view the world, and I have to go and have an existential crisis and sort of come back and start all over again. So
That must be exhausting,
with
having
you.
an existential crisis every week. That must be very quite tough.
Yes, it's why I love keeping him around.
Did you know that she came close to a compliment there? Usually she's
Wow.
kicking me.
Well, only when we have guests. Anyway, Justin, it sounds like you've sort of had this sense that the ground has sort of been shifting away from the no longer new atheists for the last decade or so. Do you have any thoughts on why you think they've lost ground? Or is it just that what seemed persuasive in 2005 just doesn't really seem as persuasive now?
I think there's a couple of sort of big picture reasons why. The main one really is that I think the problems they were pointing out with religion, they had a particular answer to it, and it was let's just look at science and reason forward, basically, and dispense with religious answers to anything. And the issue is that science and reason are great for some things, but they won't buy you a meaningful life, and they're not the tools people need to answer the big ultimate questions of life. And so I think they just, no one ultimately found that their deeper existential questions were answered by the new atheists, and so their audience just moved on, I think, because actually they were looking for deeper answers than just science and reason. So there was that, and I think there was a sort of rather naive optimism on the part of the new atheists that once we had dispensed with religion, we would move into a kind of utopia of free thinking and reason and so on. And it just didn't materialize in many ways by sweeping the floor of Christianity and the Christian story. It sort of opened up a void, which all sorts of other, I think, quasi-religious stories have now come to sort of take the place of. So a lot of those new atheists are now dealing with a sort of all kinds of other issues in their own backyard that for them are actually far worse than the kind of Christianity they once had a problem with, So that's all happened. But at the same time, I sort of was watching from the sidelines, through the 2000s and 2010s, a kind of gradual internal meltdown of new atheism itself, because once the initial honeymoon phase was over, and they'd all kind of got together and agreed that religion was bad for you and God didn't exist, it turned out there was very little else they could agree on. When it came to actually building a sort of more positive movement from this, they suddenly started really falling out with each other. And in a way, it was like the culture wars coming early for the new atheists, because they started to internally have all kinds of fractures and warring on issues around, feminism and LGBT and transgender and so on. And one part of the movement went in a very progressive direction. Another part of the movement went in a very sort of more conservative, anti-woke, quote unquote, direction. And that led to like far worse arguments between the new atheists than any arguments they'd had with Christians, and sort of, Richard Dawkins being stripped of his Humanist of the Year award by the American Humanist Association, and, conferences being cancelled because the speakers were no longer willing to share a stage with each other. So all of that sort of interesting to watch, this sort of quite spectacular meltdown as it happened. And I think that's just a factor of the fact that it's like any sort of human institution, it's very fallible. It's made up of fallible human beings, and almost like any church that goes through splits after a while, the new atheism had sort of had some religious characteristics of that sort, and it also kind of went through various splits that meant it ended up kind of a bit of a shadow of its former self in the end.
In our last episode, we were looking at some more famous cultural figures who have started sort of endorsing Christianity in one sense or another. And so are there areas other than people like this, these cultural figures, that we've been seeing, in your opinion, a rebirth of belief in God? Like, for example, in areas of study like science and consciousness, where thinkers are moving away from like a more materialist paradigm?
Yeah, so obviously a lot of my book and the podcast series does deal with some of the folk you've been touching on recently, and some people like Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson and so on. But yes, I mean, I was noticing this change in the conversation in the latter years that I was hosting the Unbelievable show, because I was finding that more and more people were turning up for these secular thinkers, but who were coming to more sort of sympathetic to Christianity kind of conclusions. But it wasn't just these sort of cultural thinkers, psychologists and others. I was noticing, from my vantage point, because I was doing a lot of conversations in a lot of areas, I was also seeing just a drift and a move away from or against a kind of atheist naturalist perspective on everything, and more secular thinkers in these different spheres kind of opening up, not to exactly Christian or theistic conclusions, but certainly pushing against a kind of very overtly naturalistic sort of hypotheses. So in the areas of sciences, obviously it's been sort of talked about quite a bit in apologetic circles, the fact that there's been some remarkable aspects of the universe and science that appear to test the idea that this is just a random universe, that we are just a fluke chance. Things like the fine-tuning of the universe for life in physics, where it looks like the fundamental constants and values of the universe seem to be precisely dialed just what they need to be in order for there to be chemistry and ultimately life in the universe. Various hypotheses have been put forward for why that might be. Maybe we're part of a multiverse and we just happen to be in one of the many universes where the conditions are just right. But those have multiverse hypotheses have their own problems. I won't go into the detail, but essentially that's led a number of mainstream secular scientists, people like Paul Davies, for instance, to say, I think something deeper is going on in the universe than just with just the result of purely natural blind forces, if you like. Now, he doesn't call that God, but he doesn't wear the label atheist either. And he talks about there being, he says, when he's spoken to me about it, I guess it's a bit like that feeling Einstein had, what Einstein called a cosmic religious feeling. And when I've spoken to other scientists as well, in the areas of both cosmology, but also origin of life and things like that, people like Roger Penrose, just a number of sort of interesting figures. Again, they're not sort of, they're very wary of kind of going down the God route, but they're very much not in the biological naturalists like Richard Dawkins. And so it's been interesting to see the way within that sphere, there's a kind of a movement. And even in evolution, I'd say there's this kind of third way evolution movement, which is picking up a lot of steam in mainstream science, which is rejecting a kind of very simplistic neo-Darwinian version of the blind forces that Richard Dawkins talks about in The Blind Watchmaker, and recognizing that actually living systems have this kind of teleology to them. And so there's people like Dennis Noble in Oxford who are really pressing into this and have done major conferences at the Royal Society and things kind of. And the interesting thing about this is it seems to be opening the door for purpose essentially in nature and biology. So all that stuff I find fascinating, and it's kind of it's just a bigger bit of this. And then yes, I could talk about consciousness and the way that what I would say is the kind of materialist, physicalist understanding of the brain is starting to be pushed against by the rise of panpsychism, for instance, in a lot of academic literature. This idea that actually consciousness is somehow fundamental to the universe, which obviously is very different to naturalism, which says it's just physical stuff that's fundamental to the universe. All of that, I think, is going on. And again, it's pushing against this naturalist framework. And so lots of other areas too. There's just really interesting things happening. Aren't always kind of headline news. They're not these aren't necessarily household names in the way that some of the more popular influencers and characters that we see talking about Christianity in the public square are. But I see it all of a piece that there's lots of things happening in lots of areas, which is just saying the story we've been given for the last 100 years ago, that actually it's all just a clockwork universe. It's all completely natural. There's nothing else going on. Basically, it's all an illusion if we think there is. I just think that is starting to really feel a bit old now, and people are actually like in mainstream academia, not just in Christian apologetics, if you like. It's these questions are being raised about that whole paradigm.
Okay. Well, turning back to some of the more cultural figures that we mentioned a moment ago, the Jordan Peterson, Tom Hodder, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, people like this. I'm encouraged in some ways, but I also have the queasy sense that many of these figures, from those who are just pleading the virtues of Christianity right through to those who are newly claiming to have become Christian, that they are in fact instrumentalizing Christianity as a support of the things they wanted to uphold anyway. This would even be true, I fear, of my hero, the late Roger Scruton. Do you think that that's what's happening, or do you think I'm being overly cynical or suspicious?
I think to some extent you're absolutely correct, and and there's kind of people who are, people who genuinely sort of say, I see Christianity as a useful fiction, basically, and it's a sort of, I'm not going to argue against it because I think it's good for us, but don't expect me to believe it. And those are, and it's interesting because this quote unquote rebirth of belief in God, it's some of the characters in it are in that camp, definitely, who just see it for its instrumental value. But what's different, I suppose, even there, is that they're not dismissing it in the way the New Atheists did, who believed it was not only untrue but bad for you. These are the ones saying, well, it may not be true, but it's really good for us. Now, I agree with you that it's not good enough. Obviously, I don't want people to stop there. And I think if you're sort of advocating for Christianity purely on the basis that you think it's politically or socially or culturally beneficial, then you're starting from the wrong starting place, and you'll never get the fruits in the end anyway if you don't have the roots that actually the belief in Christ and the Spirit and everything else that actually gave shape to the values that many of these people feel we should be defending. So I'm no fan of the sort of political Christianity, that is sometimes out there. I do find, though, there are people somewhere in the middle of this who are both recognizing the value of Christianity and have become very drawn to it themselves, actually. And I might include, say, someone like Tom Holland there, the historian, who has obviously done a lot of work in his thesis in Dominion, looking at the way the Christian revolution shaped the moral instincts of the West. And, I think is at some level concerned about what we're losing in the process of losing the Christian story, but finds himself very drawn to the Christian story himself, not only intellectually, but sort of emotionally and spiritually, and sort of teeters on the edge of belief, basically. Similarly with Jordan Peterson. Now, Jordan Peterson might be one of these characters who sort of has cultural reasons for wanting to kind of get into the Christian story. And again, I'm not sort of endorsing that as a good reason to embrace Christianity. Having said all that, if Ayaan Hirsi Ali sort of opens up to Christian faith because she suddenly realizes how valuable it is from her perspective to culture, I think God can draw straight with crooked lines. There are all kinds of motivations that bring people to faith. Might be that you fancied the girl in the youth group and that was why you went to church and became a Christian. But God can use all of our faulty motivations. My only hope is that for people perhaps who came in with a very political sort of axe to grind, they'll realize that Jesus transcends those categories, and that actually we're in great danger of making just another idol for ourselves if we think that's ultimately what Christianity is. So I think there's a lot of wheat and tares growing up together in this movement, and it is important to try and separate them. But at the same time, let's acknowledge the good that is potentially happening in the process as well.
Right. I mean, C.S. Lewis's sentence, like so many of his sentences, is constantly rattling around in my brain. The true doctrine may be a doctrine which, if we accept, we die. So yeah, that applies, I think, with some of these people too. But the flip side of this, of course, is that Christians have got a dreadful track record, not just recently, but over hundreds of years of fangirling about anyone famous or powerful who offers them legal protection, like Constantine, or a whiff of power, like some modern authoritarian leaders, or social credibility, like Jordan Peterson, or street cred, like Kanye West and Russell Brand, and it almost always ends in tears and being compromised. What about this time? What should the attitude of Christians be towards this kind of uplift, as it were?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I think we've come a cropper many a time by sort of heralding for the latest celebrity as, you know, our hero, and they always let you down, don't they? So Kanye West being a very pertinent case in point, where lots of people were posting about his conversion a few years ago. Now he's off making porn movies or something. So, you know, that's just one example of someone who's kind of certainly shouldn't put your trust in princes and all the rest of it. I think all I am pointing to interesting, fairly high profile examples of people suddenly becoming very interested in or even converting to Christianity. What I hope I'm always making clear that this isn't either the proof of Christianity being true, and nor should any of these examples be the thing that we turn to out of an endorsement or some kind of messiah figure for Christianity, because they all have feet of clay, and at various levels, you know, I have differences of opinion with them, you know, whether it be politically or theologically or whatever. I just think it's really interesting that this new openness appears to be happening. A lot of people have said, are you going to interview Russell Brand about his, you know, apparent conversion to Christianity? And I'm very pleased, and I've no reason not to take it at face value that he's gone on this, you know, extraordinary journey and has had some sort of transformative experience, being baptized, obviously, and talking very openly about his faith. On the other hand, I haven't approached at this point, you know, for an interview, because I think there's also a lot of unanswered questions about Russell Brand's history in terms of, you know, all these allegations about sexual abuse and so on. Notwithstanding the fact that obviously I believe as a Christian that there's you know, we're all made new in Christ, but that doesn't obviously stop justice being done if there is justice to be done. And so I'm kind of that's one example where I'm very keen to say to sort of caveat whatever, you know, Christians might feel excited about that and so on, just to say, look, wonderful, if something's happened in Russell Brand's life, that's brilliant, but let's not sort of hold him up as some kind of moral exemplar, because I think there's, you know, there's going to be things that need to be brought out into the light potentially there, and we need to bear in mind the people who may be affected adversely in that way. So it's tricky, isn't it? I'm not saying it's not tricky, but I don't want to at the same time ignore the fact that something's happening in the culture, and some of these folk are interesting examples of what's going on at the moment.
Right. Now, in March this year, you wrote an article in Spectator, which was given the title, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure you didn't choose the title, "The Christian Revival is Underway in Britain."
That's correct. I did not choose the title. No, when I saw the title, I was like, oh, that's not exactly what I'm describing here, but okay.
Right. My sense is that we're a very long way from revival in Britain, but I do suspect either that a corner has nevertheless been turned, or perhaps is in the process of being turned. My sense was, since I became a Christian myself in the 70s, things seem to be going up until I would say the early to mid 1990s, and then kind of flattened out. And Britain has become more and more aggressively secularist, and things have been on the way down. But I talked this through with my daughter, who's quite close to the heart of stuff that's still going on in Britain. Obviously, I don't live in Britain now. She works in a Christian ministry in Oxford, and tends towards the same view that we are actually turning a corner. Would that be an overstatement, or what do you think? Where do you think we are?
Yeah, so I definitely shy away from the word revival, because I think there are definite things that constitute a revival, and we're certainly not there at this point. Turning a corner, it depends what you mean by that. I suppose the phrase I've sometimes used is that I feel like the tide is starting to turn, and that's a reference in many ways to Matthew Arnold's famous image of Dover Beach and the Sea of
Yep.
Faith, the melancholy long withdrawing roar of the Sea of Faith and all of that.
Yeah.
And it was actually a conversation with Douglas Murray a few years ago, along with N.T. Wright, where he said, as a sort of self-confessed kind of conflicted agnostic himself, Douglas Murray said, the thing about the Sea of Faith, Justin, is it doesn't only withdraw, it could come back in again. That's the point of tides. And he was saying that in the context of himself seeing some surprising examples of his own contemporaries and peers converting to Christianity. And so it was enough to make him sit up and take notice. And I was noticing similar things, some really interesting adult conversions to Christianity of very intelligent thinking people that you might not expect to go that route. And again, I was seeing the rise of these figures who were suddenly no longer dismissing Christianity outright, but were even pointing their large audiences back to the value of faith and the Bible and everything else. So I kind of sort of adopted Douglas Murray's sort of metaphor there of the idea of the tide could be turning. And I think that's, for me, that's what this is at the moment. It's certainly not resulting in masses of people attending church. If anything, those graphs have only been going in one direction for the last couple of decades. And although there are signs that there might be some sort of leveling off in various places, it still looks pretty dire, in the UK and elsewhere. Having said all that, I do feel like A, that sort of new atheist moment is over, and B, I think there are genuine statistical signs that Gen Z, the most unchurched, most non-religious generation of all, are nevertheless, funnily enough, the most open generation as well, more so than the millennials and the Gen X's, because it's almost like because they've almost never been to church, they don't have any religious baggage to kind of hold them down, but they're also kind of open to everything spiritually. You go into TikTok and there's lots of spiritual content on there. It's all very wacky. It's witch talk and crystals and all kinds of stuff. But it's like the atheism thing, it's kind of withered. But so people are open to kind of something. And I feel like they're at a point now where actually they're almost ready again to hear the Christian story. And again, this kind of goes back to a central point in my book and podcast, which is that I think we're all made to live in a story. And the problem is the story we've been told, the atheist naturalist story, just hasn't delivered. And so people are now filling the void, as I say, with all kinds of other quasi-religious stories. But I think they're also finding none of those are ultimately satisfying. It's why we've got a mental health crisis and a sort of meaning crisis on our hands. And that's why I feel the time might be now that people are just starting to be ready to hear and respond to the Christian story again.
So over here in the US, I don't think that I'm nearly as optimistic as Mike in that we don't really appear to be even turning a corner. We sort of seem to be heading steeply downward for the immediate future. Do you happen to have any hope for us or any encouraging words?
Well, can I just cut in there for a moment? Because it seems to me that, I agree with that completely. I've just been in Croatia for a couple of years after having lived in the States for nearly 20 years. And it seems to me that there's two things going on there. First, the church in America had much further fall because it was so much bigger and had so much greater social prominence than the church in Britain and most other countries in the West. But the other thing is, of course, that a very large segment of that Christianity had aligned itself completely with one particular kind of political force. And what that has meant is that a whole load of the young generation, I remember this from teaching in college over there, loads of the kids had a whole load of baggage from Christianity that they were anxious to dump, and then, of course, went shooting off in a completely opposite direction. And I'm not sure how far much of that is rescuable for the foreseeable future. From your own contacts in America and visits there, what do you think about that?
I guess I agree. And I think that's a lot of the reasons why people have rejected the church are at the doorstep of the church itself. And we're still living in a highly politicized church culture in the US, which is putting a lot of people off religion altogether. And so there's going to be a lot of sifting, I think, and deconstructing still to go in that before you potentially see something coming around. Having said that, I think the issues that are facing young people in America are just as prevalent as Europe or anywhere else in the West in terms of the mental health crisis and everything else. So actually, it's interesting, even in the US, I'm seeing in various ways, that there's the new atheist thing has certainly diminished, I'd say, there as well. And there's a kind of a much more of an openness to the value of spirituality. It's just people, I think, still have obviously certain segment of the culture still have very negative associations with parts of the church. So I think it is a mixed bag at the moment in the USA. Having said that, it is a very diverse church. I mean, I was out in the USA in August and on the west coast of California, visiting 4 churches sort of in a loose network there, filled to the brim with very young congregations, very passionate Christians. Now that may be just one sort of particular example, and you can't sort of say that's true of everyone, but those were churches which were consciously trying to sort of transcend the political divides going on in the US. And I think there's a sort of a generation of a particular kind of part of the church that is very much trying to get past those sorts of issues that continue to dog large parts of the church in the USA. So I'm kind of hopeful that there's always in that sense a remnant who really get the gospel and really understand that they have to be part of something much bigger than just their current cultural situation in the USA. And so I'm hopeful that there's enough there for God to work with, and at whatever point the right point is for that to happen. The US, in a sense, people have often said, is always just so many years behind the UK or Europe in terms of its secularization, and it may be that it has to get worse before it gets better. I feel like the UK and Europe has arguably reached its lowest ebb, and the signs are that things are happening that are starting to turn that corner. So I've seen, for instance, it's very interesting to see the highest number of baptisms and confirmations in France in the Catholic Church.
I was about to mention France,
on record last year. That took a lot of people by surprise, I think. Very secular country for that to happen in. Some very interesting research in Finland, of all places, on the number of young men doubling in churches in recent years. Now, again, these might just be sort of weird anomalies, who knows, but it fits the feeling I've been picking up more broadly, that people feel ready for a change almost. Some of it's tied into, nationalistic sentiments. There's obviously the rise of populism and the far right sort of feelings in parts of Europe. And it's sometimes difficult to pull apart some of the motivations for why people want to return to something traditional, like the Catholic Church say, that might be tied in with the feelings people are having about Islam and immigration as well in France. So, as I say, a lot of this you won't probably really understand until we're standing a bit further away from it in the future.
Do you think that 2020, and sort of the whole global pandemic and the scare that comes with that, do you think that has played a lot of influence into these trends?
I think it accelerated trends that were already there to some extent, and I think it's really sort of gave another jolt to the mental health crisis that was already afoot by 2020. And I think it sort of was also a kind of do or die moment for a lot of churches, frankly, which, I know a lot of churches that kind of almost closed up shop because they were struggling to start with, and then COVID kind of finished it off. I think I've seen other churches, on the other hand, bounce back very strongly from COVID. And even, this year, a number of churches, and again, it's kind of anecdotal, but enough to make you sit up and take notice. Churches talking about record numbers at Easter, for instance, in their churches. So I'm kind of wondering whether for the churches that kind of made it through, we might be seeing a bit of a bump effect 2 or 3 years after COVID, of kind of people who sort of did certainly feel the effects of it. And it sort of, there were lots of stories at the time, weren't they, of people kind of becoming philosophical and thinking about their own mortality and everything naturally at that time. And I just wonder whether some of that is starting to filter through now into church ago and so on, because as I say, there has been some really interesting stories about the numbers of people suddenly inquiring, turning up in churches and that kind of thing. Again, that stuff has at this point statistical accuracy, but I get the sense that a lot of church leaders I've spoken to feel like something's changed a bit in the atmosphere, even in the last year or so.
Yeah, I think, at least from what I could tell, the churches around us that did really well were the ones that had really great live streaming abilities, and sort of the technology to support that. So it's interesting. I guess something that I never thought would be such an important player, became suddenly very important to people. So
It did, but at the same time, I'd say it's also the churches that have managed to go back to really good community as well that are doing well on that front, because I think the live streaming thing did tail off eventually and people kind of got just sick of being on screens basically. So I think if you can do both really well, great. But I mean, in our church, for example, we did the live streaming quite well, but we were really desperate to get back to in person, and we've definitely seen a kind of a big bump in sort of, we're now got more people coming in person than we had before COVID, but a lot of them have changed. There's been a lot of sort of churn, if you like, but we're seeing a lot of new people who are really interested in faith now, kind of, coming out of the wash of COVID in that way.
yeah, that's exciting to see. Also, in our last episode, Mike, right at the end, Mike sort of put forward a theory of apologetics, just taking into consideration, where we are culturally and politically and whatnot, that a really great way to reach people now might be around the idea of like people being created in the image of God and just sort of ascribing this value to people. Have you thought much about that, or do you, just from this preliminary conversation, do you think that is a good apologetic strategy?
Can I
Just
say what a
repeat
little
that
bit of my
for me.
rationale
Yeah,
was there?
yeah, go ahead,
It's that
Mike. Yeah.
we've got such social disintegration now, particularly the disintegration of the family, the long ongoing consequences of the 1960s sexual revolution. People don't trust one another. Men and women are increasingly alienated from one another. Their experience of family life has often been disastrous. There's a whole lot of self-loathing, and this is a big part. I mean, I differ from those who want to ascribe the mental health crisis entirely to social media. I think that's done no more than speed up what was there anyway. And that in that situation, Christians talking about the value of everybody, of people as creating the image of God, is, I think, hugely important to people who, even though they manifest as being angry, are actually hating themselves. It's just that.
Yeah, no, I really agree with that analysis, and it's interesting. I think as culture has gone in increasingly kind of progressive directions in terms of, I guess, everything being up for grabs, there being no definition now of humans really, and you can sort of invent your own adventure now. You can invent your own identity. You can, everything is so fluid that I think that is all contributed to as I say, this meaning crisis, because people, that actually creates a huge amount of anxiety and burden, especially on young people, because they're not given a template. They once had a script, a story that was kind of handed to them, and that wasn't always great. Obviously, there were downsides to that, but at the same time, it kind of gave a sense of security that no longer exists, I think, in our culture. And you put that hand in hand with, as you say, Mike, the breakdown of family and everything. I've seen manifest in all kinds of ways. The sexual revolution. I know you've, I think, talked about Louise Perry on your show, and I've had a couple of conversations with her, and that's just a fascinating example of a, secular feminist thinker who came to remarkably Christian conclusions in the process of sort of looking at the sexual revolution. and realizing it was actually been pretty bad for women and children, especially. And she has started to see a lot of young people getting really sort of kind of going in a very different direction. You know, the rise of the sort of so-called trad stuff, you know, where they're consciously rejecting values of the sexual revolution because they've realized it hasn't worked out well for me. You know, all it's resulted in is a lot of porn addicted, unhappy, you know, people who can't, you know, are not getting married or having families. And so there's almost like, I feel like as the pendulum swings so far, there's comes a point at which it starts to swing back the other way just because people can't deal with the consequences of it any longer. Equally, like on the, I think for young men, there's this kind of crisis of masculine identity going on in the culture as well, because they just have all the normal roles have been taken away. So many of them don't have any kind of a father figure in their life. And that's why these, you know, male influencers like Jordan Peterson and at the really toxic end, Andrew Tate and everything else have become so popular, is because they're desperate for someone to sort of tell them how to live and what to do. Not all the answers are good, obviously. But I do feel like all of this is, again, laying the ground for the true answer to all of these things, the true identity, the one who truly gives us our humanity, Jesus, to kind of for people, to sit up and listen. I think it's only one thing get this bad that suddenly people are awoken to the possibility that there might be something in this Christian story. So that's kind of my hope. But sadly, it probably have to get worse before it gets better. As I say, I feel like it's starting to bottom out, but it could still look pretty messy in the process.
We can't say Nietzsche didn't warn us.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this, Justin. I'm sure that's really going to help a lot of people. It's been really good to make contact with you again, and thank you for talking about some of the things in your book, your recent book now. We will be giving links to the book and to the podcasts, and we really would encourage our viewers to connect those, buy the book. So, yes, thank you very much for being with us, everybody. And we'll see you again next week when we're going to be starting a new series on a, completely different theme. Slightly related, but certainly different. So thank you very much, Justin. And thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for having me on. Thank you.